Let's do that, rubber chicken. Hey, good morning, everybody. It's a wild Wednesday here in Washington, D.C. It's day 50-something or other of United States of America versus Joe Biggs. And I'm thinking to myself, damn, I've been here so long. You know, how long have I been in Washington, D.C.? When I came home, or when I came here from home, I brought with me toothpaste and deodorant. You know, yes, because I do try to take care of hygiene, appearances notwithstanding. And I had to buy a new tube of toothpaste and a new stick of deodorant.
Look at you. Look
Yeah.
at you.
No, but I had to do that a while ago. How long have I been here? This weekend, I got to go buy. I've gone through another tube of toothpaste, and another thing of deodorant. And I've gone through a change of seasons, that we're getting ready. The trees are starting to blossom here. It's springtime in Washington, D.C. And, there it is, day 54 of United States versus Joe Biggs. Looks, and the case just doesn't show any sign of ending. I mean, we're going to. We've begun to put on defense witnesses. It's not clear whether the defendants themselves will testify. We're going to go over the jury charge tomorrow afternoon during the afternoon while one of the jurors has a medical issue. And typically going over the jury charge, that is where the judge meets with the lawyers to try to determine what law he will read to them. That's a big event in a trial, because where there are ambiguities in the law, or laws are little used and there isn't a whole lot of case law to guide courts on what to say, there is fertile ground for creativity. Nowhere more so than in one of the charges here. That's under 18 United States Code section 1512, wherein these guys are accused of obstructing Congress, but with a corrupt intent. And so, it's one thing to obstruct an event by showing up and, throwing water balloons, let's say. But does that necessarily mean that you did so with a corrupt intent? And what does it mean to have a corrupt intent? If any if any intent to disrupt is corrupt, well, then you don't need to modify intent with corruptly. So if corruptly is going to have some purpose, it presumably limits intent, and says by saying that some intents, while unlawful, may not meet the definition of this statute. And so therefore we need to come up with a definition of what corruptly means. So you look corrupt up in the dictionary and you see usually it means for some venal motive, for some personal gain or whatnot. So here's a wild question in the Proud Boys case. Suppose these guys did interfere with Congress. Suppose they intended to do so. What if they didn't do so with a corrupt intent? Then they're not guilty of the crime charged. And wouldn't it be the case that if the president of the United States, the highest elected officer in the land, is just a short distance away, saying you've got to stop them from stealing the election. If you don't fight like hell, we won't have a country anymore. If he's encouraging people to believe that their election process had been interfered with and their votes stolen, and he asked them to interfere with Congress in the counting of the electoral votes to prevent that national tragedy from occurring, is that corrupt? Usually when we think of corruption, we think of somebody dipping into the till, or perhaps trying to take the office for themselves, or buying a lobbyist, or paying for a vote. So, what the judge decides to do with the charge on corruption will go a long way toward settling what can and can't be argued in closing arguments in the case. So stay tuned.
Well, inquiring minds want to know, Norm, what sort of toothpaste do you use?
Well, I use Crest, and I'm a Crest man and have used Crest forever, because I don't ever want my teeth to look as though they are crestfallen, and it is so inquiring minds now know. And you can send your tax deductible donations to the United States of America versus Joe Big in the form of toothpaste, and you can write it off as a charitable contribution, because
a dump truck of toothpaste would be interesting.
Yeah, no, it would be. Speaking of dump trucks, let's talk about Trump trucks. It is reported that an indictment has been returned, and I see President Trump set to appear. Grand jury reported to convene today. Is it not the case, Mike, that they returned an indictment? I thought I read that last night.
If they returned it last night, then I am wrong. However, I will confirm while you talk. From what I read, that they were going to convene today to vote.
Okay.
To return an indictment. But he had already said that he was going to appear regardless, and that was slated for next week.
All right. Well, I may have misread what I may have misread it. In any case, the extradition battle will be moot, and wisely so, in my view. I think that Trump will appear in Manhattan. I'm told, and I think I reported this yesterday, that arrangements have already been made to seal off the entire building at Center Street at the criminal court, so that he can walk into a courtroom accompanied by Secret Service agents, be processed, and whisked out of the building with a new court date. Some people have said, is the president going to be placed in handcuffs? And the answer is probably not. He probably will be given special treatment. He'll probably be walked into a room, photographed, his fingerprints taken, and then walked right into a courtroom where he can plead not guilty, and his lawyers will be given a new court date. It'll be an interesting legal battle. I don't understand New York law well enough to know how any set of charges survives the statute of limitations challenge at this point, unless those charges arise from the investigation itself. Giving sworn false testimony, or a perjury charge, or filing false information within a 5-year window. But I've got to assume that Alvin Bragg is more than a fat Alvin, as you said earlier. Like this morning, hey, this is Fat Alvin. I'm coming to get you, Donald. In the WWE of criminal law, that would be quite the match. Can you see the ring? This pudgy fat boy from Manhattan attacking Mr. Vanity himself. Donald Trump. You imagine Donald Trump getting in the mirror in the morning, doing his hair, taking an air pick to his teeth, and looking in the mirror saying, "Who lives better than me, baby? Who's got you?" So the Donald versus Fat Albert will be quite a war.
You are so handsome. You are so handsome.
So hot. Yeah. Don't you? Oh, the women just love you. Oh.
I was listening to a podcast upon which Harmeet Dillon appeared. And I was listening to that very, very early this morning. And of course, the Dillon Law Group is home to friend of the podcast and
Ron Coleman
in general. Yeah, Ron Coleman. But Harmeet Dillon and a couple of other attorneys in her office, namely those that deal in white collar crime and that sort of stuff, they have been working on the civil side of this issue in New York for several years now. And I didn't know that the anatomy of this case spans all the way over to the Ninth Circuit, Norm, with Stormy Daniels and a lot of that stuff. Harmeet and her law firm were the crew that secured the judgments in favor of Trump for Stormy Daniels' wayward, capricious claims against the former president. What she was saying, though, and she brought up a couple of issues. One, she stated pretty affirmatively that she believed that there was a preemption issue, that federal law would preempt state law, at least with respect to the elections issues, right? So any allegations of campaign finance violation, et cetera, that would exist under New York state law should be preempted by federal law, and that because the Department of Justice and because the Federal Elections Commission each declined to investigate further on these issues and did so substantively, not just in a procedural context, that should matter. On the issue of statute of limitations, again, it's a misdemeanor, and there isn't a reason to even be talking about this unless we're talking about a felony. So I think I referenced yesterday very briefly that there was a way that the foundational case, if the facts are there, could be elevated to a felony, and then that felony would carry with it a 5-year statute of limitations. Now, I wasn't aware that New York did some sort of statutory thing during COVID to toll the statute of limitations.
Well, that's an interesting question. Okay.
So there's a lot there, but again, it doesn't really move me away from believing that this is pretextual and political. But it is interesting to at least hear from another attorney, a very prominent, successful attorney, an aggressive attorney. And I really wish that the RNC had elected Harmeet Dillon to the chair, but that's another issue entirely. But I was impressed to hear her, very resolute in her opinion on this. And I'm hopeful that that the Manhattan DA will have egg on his face. Not that he won't be inclined to eat it if he does. But this to me is so far beyond what we should be talking about.
Well, then let's not talk about it too more, but let's explain the preemption issue to people. What does that mean when a lawyer says something is preempted? We've talked about federalism before and how there is a federal limited power over life, and then there arising out of the Constitution, and then there are various state laws. And when federal law occupies an area such as federal campaign finances, and Congress expresses an intention to occupy the field, that is to take over regulation of this area, those laws preempt or have supersedence over or eliminate the ability of states to legislate in the same area. So I think what Dylan is suggesting is, to the degree that New York state officials or a municipal official in Manhattan seeks to enforce a local law regarding campaign finances, where there exists a federal law that is meant to be a comprehensive regulatory scheme, state law is preempted or forbidden from acting in that in the name of federalism. I'm not sure she's right. I'm not sure that while there may not be federal campaign financing regulations, there cannot also be concurrent state campaign financing regulations. And I haven't seen anyone else discuss that. We'll see what the litigation unfolds, but we'll see how the litigation unfolds.
Well, yeah, the indictment has not been returned yet. I was just kind of perusing, making sure to confirm that reported that the indictment would come down yesterday, right? Those are the original reports. This is something I was thinking about as well, Norm. Why is it that we have all these leaks coming out of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, to the media about this, creating a timeline for us to just kind of grasp onto? I resent that a bit, right? Especially when the timeline starts to move, right? So now we have all of this public, fanfare and speculation as to what and when and how and who. And ultimately, you've got Trump trying to bait out DeSantis to have him just declare to run for president, because everybody believes that he's going to anyway. But then you've got crossfire with Alvin Bragg, the DA up there, who's saying we won't be intimidated, blah, 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 blah. And the thing is, why hasn't all this just occurred and then we have a document to look at and analyze? I resent this situation a lot for that reason.
In theory, grand jury proceedings are supposed to be secret. And the reason for grand jury secrecy is, if the government is looking at you, A, it's stressful, B, it's bad for your reputation. So if you found out your next door neighbor or your roommate or your spouse was the subject of a grand jury investigation, your first thought would be what? Geez, I wonder what they did. What did they do wrong? Why is the government looking at them? Well, maybe they've done nothing wrong. And so grand jury secrecy is designed to protect the truly innocent from the government's legitimate right to investigate. There are leaks, and there may be actionable leaks. Suppose, for example, that Donald Trump doesn't get indicted. Suppose the grand jury concludes that for whatever reasons they're not going to return the indictment. The mere leakage of that has done damage to Trump's, arguably, I don't know that you can damage Trump's reputation, but if it were a private person who enjoyed peace and tranquility, and it had been reported that they had been the subject of a grand jury investigation, they could have an action against the leaker, and that action would penetrate prosecutorial immunity, because while prosecutors are immune from their acts as advocates, that is, you cannot sue them. There's prosecutorial immunity for their charging decisions, for their decision to call a witness, for their behavior in court. You can sue them when they step outside the advocacy function, and leaking material to the media would be a basis of a suit. So the question becomes, I think, who leaked and why? Now, grand jury leaks are common. In high-profile cases. The Trump case is not unusual. Reporters will sit outside the courthouse and they'll try to follow, grand jury witnesses and lawyers to grand jury witnesses. And my hunch is that the leak here didn't come from Bragg's office. My hunch is that the leak probably came from a lawyer associated with the case. And Trump has been known to be proactive. So he was the one who came out and said he expected to be arrested next week. The communications within Bragg's office about the case, that's not grand jury material. I suspect Bragg is responsible for leaking that to raise his profile. And so, it's a tawdry mess for both of them. And I guess because Trump is a politician and Bragg wants to be, it's going to be front and center on the national stage for a long time.
Well, that's unfortunate, right? So how often, Norm, do grand juries not return indictments?
It's a great question. There aren't statistics on it. Well, if there are statistics on this, I don't know where to find them, because I don't think there's, there will be grand juries convened in major municipalities constantly, and prosecutors keep them open, and they present their cases to grand juries, and grand juries in some instances indict in some others. I don't think that there's a requirement that the vote be tabulated. How many times did a grand jury refuse to return an indictment? I'm unaware of any such statistic. The lore in the trade is that a decent prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich, meaning when you've got a captive audience and you control what to tell them and when, well, you can persuade them of just about anything. So I would say the success rate is high, but that's anecdotal, and I don't have any more information on that.
It just appears to me, one last thing, it just appears to me based on all that, that the medium here is the message, right? So the substance of this case doesn't ultimately matter. If we take a step back and we just see this string of leaks, the timeline that we're now working on, the fact that a grand jury typically convenes in secret, prosecutors are able, and the threshold for returning an indictment is so much different and lesser than a conviction or anything when there is, the obligation for due process. So what appears reasonable to me to conclude is that the point of all of this was to generate the press around this issue, even if the grand jury doesn't return an indictment, which doesn't seem likely at all. But at this point, damage not done.
Well, damaged maybe. Let's be critical here and ask ourselves who benefits from all this. Donald has had trouble this year breaking into the news cycle because he's past his sell-by date in many cases, and I suspect in the minds of many, and I suspect from the standpoint of mainstream media, there is a resolute determination not to repeat the mistake of 2016. Don't give him free publicity by covering him, because that just draws his supporters out of the woodwork, and he's not paying for that. And look what happened in 2016. We took this improbable guy and made him into president. So we're going to keep him out of the news cycle now. Well, Don, if in my mind, if you look at the list of suspects who've decided to publicize this, suspect number one is Donald Trump and his campaign, because the prospect of an indictment puts him back where he loves being, on the front page and the topic of gossip by the likes of us and the likes of people far more influential than us. So I don't view him as a victim in this case. I view him as an opportunist. And the question in my mind is, did he shoot himself in the foot here? Because, he called for protests incident to his arrest. I'm hearing reports that though the crowds aren't exactly thronging to the locations, there appeared to be not many people appearing on his behalf in Manhattan yesterday. I've seen some clips of people outside his Mar-a-Lago estate. But if he thought he was going to engage the country in another piece of madness similar to January 6th, I don't see the passion for Trump that existed in 2020 or in 2016. And I wonder whether this is the beginning of his death thrall. Because I just don't see people storming to the barricades saying this is outrageous. And
well,
are you seeing that, Mike? Because if you are, I'm not seeing what you're seeing.
My observation is that perhaps MAGA has been dislodged from Trump's monopoly on it. And true, yeah, Manhattan MAGA. I think I have something here that just says, needs some protein, as I like to say. Because the protests there in Manhattan were paltry. I think what I read was that there was more media than there were protesters, which is never a great sign.
Well, I mean, I did see a classic where two people who were anti-Trump got on a courthouse step, and they were surrounded by about 50 photographers rather. And so, it looked like, wow, look at this anti-Trump event. It was two people.
Right. Well, I mean, that's not typically a good thing unless you're, Joe Biden running for president. And then in which case, I guess the counter signal is that it's fine. Everything's fine. Anyway, I put this tweet on the screen from Cernovich because I think it illustrates 2 points. And because you asked the question, who stands to benefit? I don't really know at this point that the DA, really stands to benefit from the scrutiny that he is now going to inherit around the process of this at all. Originally, I guess an easy thing to observe would be that, yeah, he has an interest because he wants to be a politician. You said that, Norm. But to me, perhaps Trump is winning in two ways here, whether he meant to or not. But if Cernovich says, look, Trump was always going to voluntarily appear, that's why you say you would review extradition. It looks strong, makes you the center of the story. Out trumps Trump. Stuff like this is obvious to me. You have to learn how to feel the music, not listen to words. So on the one hand, it puts him in the press, right? In the New York press, which is the biggest media conglomerate in the world, right? It emanates from New York, right? And then when you look at his belief, everyone's widespread belief that Governor Ron DeSantis is going to run for president, it gave him an opportunity to do something that would show strength or illustrate strength. And if that was a wager or a gamble that Trump was willing to make, he just cleaned up, in my opinion. And I think yes, he just cleaned up because someone that he would have to beat in a primary is Governor Ron DeSantis if he indeed declares. And what we saw and what Cernovich is putting up here is that he made a huge miscalculation in being very middle of the road and reserved about this issue, because we talked about the legal elements of extradition. I found that Florida statute that gives him the power to refer this to, the legal offices there in Florida for review of whether to surrender someone subject to an out-of-state extradition order. And so we know that the framework at least exists to allow what Cernovich is saying to prosper. So from one angle, Trump is simultaneously taking out his primary GOP competitor for the primary and also putting his name in the news, good, bad, or ugly. So the only person winning at this point, to me, is Trump. However, I am also seeing at the same time that MAGA is not necessarily the same thing. It's not synonymous with Trump anymore. And that's why there wouldn't be protesters there, because as you know, working on the January 6th case on behalf of Joe Biggs, and just reading about the hundreds of thousands of people indicted pursuant to that, Trump led people there, and they are all of these individual defendants, their lives have been turned upside down. And he's not really anywhere to be found from that respect. I know that there are people out there that would say, oh, he's donated money and he's done this and that and the third. There isn't really a whole lot of
I don't believe he has. I believe it's bullshit.
And so I think that there's a huge vulnerability in Trump trying to call people to do anything now, because the question is, to what end and what support are you going to offer? Right.
Let me reframe this discussion about Donald Trump and DeSantis in the election. I'm going to ask you a personal question, Mike. Ready?
Yep.
When your parents have sex, is it missionary or doggy style?
I don't care, right?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. That is exactly my point. I don't care about DeSantis or Trump. And this whole story has the feel of a debate about our parents getting it on behind the room. I mean, this is just beneath the American public. It's tawdry politics. I wonder whether this is R.I.P. rest in peace for Donald Trump. I look at his calls for protest. I see the fears, that we're going to have J6, repeated in metropolitan areas, a sort of right-wing Antifa, takeover of our cities or something. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that this sideshow between DeSantis and Trump's call for popular support, the fact that the populace isn't responding, may be a sign that the canary in the coal mine, which is how I've referred to Trump for 6 years, is starting to succumb to the gas. And in my view, all for the better, because I think we have reached our sell-by date in Trump. Here's one issue I'd like people to focus on, though, as you watch this event unfold and you watch discussions about protests in the cities. Who is investigating the protesters? I think there's an emerging national story that I thought might in part be told by way of the J6 trial involving the Proud Boys. It appears it won't, and I'll have more to say about it later. But I'd like to know, after the trial, I mean to say, when I can't be accused of extrajudicial, prejudicial pretrial comments. by prosecutors who I think listen to this. Good morning, folks. See you this afternoon, or see you soon. Who watches our domestic protests? The FBI got in a lot of trouble in the 70s when the Church Committee investigated what was going on. This was when it was discovered, that the FBI had been surveilling in Media, Pennsylvania, across from the courthouse. There was a local FBI office. And if you're ever in Media, I tried a case there a couple of years ago. There's a plaque. This is where protesters broke into the FBI office and discovered files about the FBI's domestic surveillance of dissent. And so the FBI had infiltrated civil rights organizations. The FBI had tried to sow dissension between black leaders, spreading rumors about Martin Luther King. And the FBI was infiltrating domestic groups. I'm telling you right now, it's going on in the United States today.
There's no question, Norm. I don't think that anybody with a functioning frontal lobe disagrees with you.
Well, so Jim Jordan, if you happen to be watching, stop writing MASH notes and stupid sideshow notes to Fat Alvin in Manhattan. Fat Alvin Bragg is doing his job as a Manhattan district attorney. If he can persuade a grand jury to indict, fine. Then let Trump defend himself. Let a regular jury decide whether there's a case there or not. But in terms of the domestic surveillance of dissent in the United States, I think Trump's call for rallies in response to his arrest is going to offer a quick window for people wary enough and woke enough to keep an eye out about who's actually in these crowds. I suspect, I don't suspect, I know that the FBI is sensitive to the need to protect First Amendment freedoms of association. I also know the FBI spends tens, if not hundreds, if not millions of dollars on confidential informants. That is, people who are embedded in or who are parts of domestic groups that the FBI has an eye on, and that these people are paid by the FBI to report on their colleagues. And so I fear that one of the things that is suppressing crowd turnout in response to the Trump call for protest is J6. Yes. And people are saying, look, they just announced 1,000 more prosecutions of people who turned out in Washington on January 6th. I better not go to New York. I better not go to Mar-a-Lago because I might get arrested for protesting. If that's the boot that has fallen on the people's neck, the people of America's neck, we've reached a very, very chilling point in this country. And so I'm hoping that people who are organizing, if there is any organization, these protests who are calling for these protests, are keeping a wary eye on who's reporting about who in these cases. Because I can tell you without saying more, that in the Joe Biggs case, the question of how to deal with the disclosure of confidential human sources has been a live wire and remains a live wire issue. And the FBI does not want to be publicly outed, placed in a position where it has to talk about its sources and methods for surveilling the American people. And from my perspective, we've come full circle. My wife has sometimes been critical of me. What's become of you? You used to defend people of color against the police. Now you're defending right-wingers, right-wing white men. And my view is, I haven't changed. I've never developed a fascination or love of government. I've always been suspicious about what power can do to individuals. I just think the needle has shifted. And so whereas 40 years ago, the FBI was fucking with the left, I think they're fucking with the right now. And it's the same. It's the same.
What happened in between then and now is an entire military entanglement in the Middle East. And so you now have veterans such as Joe Biggs back home. I think that the FBI likely perceives there to be some sort of, it may be sort of a credit to the expectation of our veterans in the United States. Does that make sense?
It does, and people have written about that. I'm trying to remember the book, but look, this is a special call out to those of you who are politically active. If you can get word to Jim Jordan and his weaponization committee, I think they should open an investigation on the FBI's use of confidential human sources in domestic groups. We've seen the FBI refer to domestic terrorism and white supremacists. Okay, what are you doing there? We've seen him open investigations of parents attending school board meetings. What are you doing there? We've seen a discussion from a whistleblower that conservative Catholics are being regarded as extremists. And so does this mean that, we've now got an FBI agent playing priest to hear the confession of somebody who may be thinking about a bomb somewhere? These are chilling steps. And it drove the country, it divided the country deeply in the 1970s. It inspired the church committee. Jim Jordan, stop wasting your time playing badminton with Fat Alvin in Manhattan and writing stupid letters about your prerogative to oversee state prosecutions, and get off your ass and do something serious about this country. Forget Donald Trump and his MAGA drama. Forget Alvin Bragg and his quest to be, Al Sharpton with a law degree. Focus on where ordinary people live. And if ordinary people are afraid to come out in the street for fear they may be prosecuted because of embedded FBI agents that are going to talk trash about them and get them involved in a federal prosecution, that's a story.
Well, and just to punctuate the sentence, because I know we're running out of time, particularly pernicious about what you're saying is the fact that everybody was locked in their homes and curtailed from mingling with each other during COVID. So we formed new habits as a society. We are already programmed to be more virtual in our professional lives, in our personal lives, et cetera. So if there is, I think that this just sort of exacerbates that problem, that if people want to express, to use their right to assemble, to protest, et cetera, it seems as though the First Amendment has in large part been chiseled into something that does not include one's ability to associate freely in the public and protest and petition for redress of grievances, right? Because in almost every single case, and I know we brought up Cernovich already, but Cernovich is someone who talks so much about the corrupt nature of the FBI, right? And the disparity between the things that they say are their priorities and then what harm actually befalls the American public.
So, I think we need to have a long form with Cernovich, because I know you like him and I like him. I've known him since 2003, but I need to ask, every time I hear Mike's name, some part of me winces because I still can't believe he got behind Pizzagate. And I'm dead serious, Mike. And so, you're both Mikes. Mike may have an astute political radar, but I still need to know how it got jammed on Pizzagate. Because to me, that cost him so much credibility. And here's a guy that I like. And here, years later, when he prognosticates, when he opens his mouth, I'm thinking, did you really believe there was sex trafficking going on at Comet Bing Bong or Pizza or whatever it was?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some due diligence we can do prior to you asking those questions. But my thought is that perhaps he has some information that he would lean on to say, look, this is what my investigation revealed, because what we know about Cernovich is that he does the dirty work.
Yeah. Well, speaking of dirty work, I got to put on my shoes and socks because I'm a barefoot hippie here this morning as we wrap at you, and head over to court for day 54, where I will from time to time say, objection,
overruled.
And the judge will respond in that way, and I'll know that I'm at home. I'm sitting right next to Dorothy on the windswept plains of, was it Canvas, or have I been blown into Oz? Come back tomorrow. Listen to us. Thanks for sharing time today.
Hey, Norm, what do you think about a Q&A tomorrow?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. I'll broadcast the invitation for a Q&A tomorrow. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, and the rest of the major podcast distribution platforms. Please put a thumbs up on this video and tell everybody about Law and Legitimacy. Norm, we will see you tomorrow. Go get him.
And call Jim Jordan and ask him what the hell the FBI is doing about domestic surveillance. I want to know.
Hey. Bye.